Beast of the Field by John C. Adams. Read by E.S. Wynn. 16-year-old Brett Flint leaned against the dresser watching Frida lathering the plates and bowls in hot, soapy water. The dairymaid's arms were immersed up to her elbows, and the smell of her lavender perfume filled the Blackacre kitchen. Frida smiled as Brett slipped his arms around her curvy waist. "Your father knows about last night." Patras had been around the northern upland hills his whole long life. Brett's father had seen it all over the years. He would laugh at his son's expense, but he was likely to resent that Brett was now a man. Brett's first time was over, and it was true. He did feel different. He felt equal to taking on his father in a way that he'd never done before. The oak door banged open, and Patras strode into the kitchen. He stank of sweat and manure after a day in the farmyard. He glared at Brett and Frida and rasped into a throaty cough. "Young love, take a turn with me tonight and I'll show you what a real man feels like. I've had a soft spot for your girl since you came here." Patras fished his amulet out of his pocket and dangled it in front of Frida. She curled her upper lip and snarled at him. Patras slung the amulet around his neck. "Perhaps I'll find another use for your girlie. Maybe you can satisfy another one of my appetites." Brett watched cautiously as his father swaggered out of the kitchen. "Your father's a monster." "He wasn't always that way," Brett murmured. Brett sat on his wooden windowsill and watched his father stomping through the garden. Patras was dragging Frida's rotund form after him. She had a rope tied to her wrists, and she was straining at it. His father was taking Frida to the barn. Brett hadn't realized until that moment how much he'd begun to care about Frida in the year she'd been working at Blackacre. Memories of the seasons spent looking after the livestock flooded back. The dairymaid had taken an interest in his schooling and encouraged him to try harder, pointing out that she'd never had much learning and few options over the work she could get. She'd been kind to him, and Brett had appreciated that. Brett slipped downstairs and pulled on his coat and boots. He ran to the barn and stared through one of the knotholes. Frida was lying on a couple of broken bales, in the exact spot where she'd made love to Brett the night before. Her hands were tied, but she snarled at Patras. "I won't have sex with you, dirty old man." "Then I'll have to find another use for you." Patras played with the amulet hanging around his neck. He was holding a halter behind his back. He rubbed the amulet with his right hand, and it slowly began to glow. Brett stumbled back to the farmhouse in terror. He had seen the amulet and its effect on women before. Whatever Patras wanted to use the amulet for, Brett was powerless to stop it. As the tendrils of blood-red sunrise began to spread across the sky, Brett got up and went to the cow shed to start milking. The smell of the midden greeted him even when he was still 50 feet away. The cows were out in the meadows overnight, but they gathered by the gates to be let into the stalls. Usually the bulls stayed with the cows out in the field, but Brett saw that his father had locked them inside overnight. He let them out first. The bulls seemed quiet. In fact, all the cattle were subdued today. Brett opened the milking shed door and let the first batch in. He knew every cow by sight, understanding their health, breeding, and milk productivity. He did a double take at the sight of a new cow. He walked round her as she lingered in the milking pens, as all the others barged into the stalls, waiting to have the teats attached to their udders. Their hooves squelched in the soft mud until they reached the concrete floors. Then the sound of their hooves was like a stream of gentle taps. She seemed unsure about where to go. She seemed confused. Brett lifted her bovine face up to him. He stared deep into her sad, brown eyes. Her eyes darted sideways, and she tried to kick him. He caught at her halter and held the rope firmly until she quieted down. She licked his hand with her rough tongue. Brett understood why there was another cow in the herd. Of all the terrible things his father had done, he'd never stooped to this before. Brett found Patras working his way through a plate of burnt fried eggs and buttered toast. "I'm thinking of taking a lorry load over to the abattoir. Might include that new little heifer that popped up here in the night." Brett folded his arms. "Put her to the bull for a bit of fun first, shall we? I like to see the look on her face. If that won't satisfy the little hussy, I don't know what will." Brett sat down at the table and started picking at his food. Patras watched Brett carefully. Brett blushed under his father's scrutiny. "Not missing your girlfriend, are you?" Brett rankled at his father's taunting tone, but he bit his tongue and kept quiet. "She can stay in the cow shed until I work out what to do with her." After breakfast, Brett ran to the milking shed and warned Frida about what his father was up to. She lowed balefully. Her big eyes tormented him. Brett didn't put it past his father to make good on his threats. He dreaded the thought of Patras hooking Frida up to the milking machine and standing by as her udders were emptied. Brett felt sure that, despite her altered shape, she could understand everything that was happening to her, just as if she was still a human being. Brett heard his father whistling the local folk tune, "The Moors of the North." Patras came round the corner into the yard and nodded at his son. He disappeared into the smaller barn, and Brett heard clanking as his father hooked the trailer up to the Land Rover. The ancient engine turned over twice. Patras turned the key viciously, swearing at the vehicle, and the engine finally roared into life with a puff of diesel fumes. Patras drove into the yard. He let down the trailer's tailgate and spread straw on it. "Ready for the first one. Abattoir said they could take 5 today. That's 4 for the butchers in Slimeport, and 1 for our freezer. Fancy steak for dinner?" Brett folded his arms. He leaned against the gate in front of Frida, hoping his father would pick other cattle if she stayed out of his way. "We'll load that new cow first." Frida set up a deep lowing that disturbed the other cows. They began to circle around the yard. One of them knocked into Brett and shoved him against the wall. He grazed his arm against the brick and stood rubbing the sore, red flesh. "Get a halter on her. We'll load her and the others will quiet down. Troublemaker, fit for the butcher." Brett didn't move. "Father, you can't. This has gone far enough. People are going to ask questions. You can't just lie about where Frida's gone." Patras brushed Brett's objections aside. He grabbed a blue halter from the nail on the door and swung it as he strode over to Frida. She lowered her head and butted him, but Patras shoved her shoulder and slipped the halter on her. Brett retched at the thought that his father was prepared to send a human being to the local slaughterhouse and let people eat her afterwards. He felt the acid sting of bile rise in his throat. Patras yanked the halter rope and dragged Frida toward the ramp. She stuck her feet out in front of her and locked her joints. She put her head down. Patras turned, slid the rope over his shoulder, and leaned forward to put all of his strength into it. Frida's head was yanked upwards. With a plaintive moo, she slid across the farmyard after her master. Her hooves were unable to get the same purchase as Patras's hobnailed boots. She wedged her front hooves against the edge of the ramp. Brett laughed as Frida braced against the ramp. Patras swore. He handed Brett the halter rope and went behind Frida to push her haunches. She lashed out at him, catching him full in the right leg. Patras cried out in agony and collapsed into the mud, clutching his leg. Tears of frustration and agony mingled with the pain, coursed down his weather-beaten cheeks as he yelled at Brett to call for help. Brett watched as the ambulance pulled away down the single-track lane to the main road. He returned to the farmyard. He put the trailer and Land Rover back in the small barn. He let the cows out into the fields as usual. The shouting and Frida's lowing had unsettled the livestock. Once they were grazing, he went back to the yard. Brett took Frida by the rope and led her along the path towards a broken-down old barn up in the hills that his grandfather had kept sheep in. Brett left Frida tied up in the barn with hay and water. She glowered at him, but he stroked her face and told her he'd be back as soon as he'd worked out what to do next. Brett dug in his pocket and fetched out his father's amulet. Patras had lost consciousness as the paramedics had been lifting him into the ambulance, and Brett had snatched the old charm. Brett went inside the farmhouse and wandered into the pantry. The huge chest freezer stood in one corner. He opened the lid and stared down into it. He hadn't been there in several days, but the last time he'd opened it, the freezer had been half empty. Now it was full of beef cuts and joints, wrapped in plastic, and neatly labeled in his father's handwriting. Brett slammed the lid shut and slid to the floor. He curled his arms around his knees and closed his eyes. He rocked on his heels until he felt the amulet pressing against him in his pocket. He fished it out and stared at it. "If you have done this to Frida, I will destroy you in the fire," Brett told the amulet. "Whatever torment you unleash on me, it'll be worth it to be rid of you, no matter what my father says when he finds out." Brett left the amulet on top of the mantelpiece in the parlor. He had to go back, no matter how much he worried that the amulet would have killed Frida by the time he got there. The amulet was often unpredictable in how it chose to wield its awful power. He had to hope that it would take his threat of its destruction seriously, and that it would release her from her torment. Brett set off along the hill path. About halfway there, he saw a naked woman running towards him. She collapsed in front of him, tears streaming down her face. "Brett, you have to help me." Brett slipped off his jacket and wrapped it around Frida. They walked back to the farmhouse in silence. Brett handed Frida the 50 pounds he'd saved up towards driving lessons. It wasn't much, but it would pay for a bus ride into town and the train to Lancaster. If he took any money from the farm's petty cash, his father would notice and go after Frida to get it back. Frida stuffed the cash into her pocket. "Thanks." They embraced. "Take care of yourself. You too."